Hello readers by eyes and by ears, this is Mighty Chen and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are continuing with the reading of Stars of Chaos Volume 5, also known as Chapeau by Priest, and we're covering some more extras today. The goal is to do 2, but we'll see, maybe I'll squeeze in a third, so I hope you all enjoy. A Father's Earnest Hopes. Within the pass lay a flat plain spanning thousands of kilometers. As one traveled inward, past Chongping, they would begin to see the banners of the northern camp fluttering at the relay stations along the road. This was the vital region surrounding the nation's capital. A detachment of Black Iron light and heavy armor infantrymen was returning from the northern border in triumph, the main army following in their wake. Personally led by the Marquis of Anding, Gu Shun, and consisting of elite soldiers from the 3 divisions of the Black Iron Battalion, these were the advanced troops charged with escorting the spoils of war back to the capital, a large shipment of violet gold, the Wolf King and his sons, the goddess of the 18 tribes, and other notable prisoners of war. As the army marched, aside from the solemn rhythm of their footsteps and hoofbeats, not a sound could be heard. The soldiers moved in lockstep, resembling at first glance the region of iron puppets and not men. When they entered the northern camp, the black steed riding at the fore lifted his iron visor and raised the hand to bring the march to a stop. The thousands of soldiers behind him immediately obeyed, becoming a sea of absolute stillness. An immense and intimidating pressure seemed to emanate from them, as if their mere presence could topple mountains. The northern camp sentry on duty shivered and broke out in gooseflesh. A member of the commander-in-chief's personal guard stepped out from the ranks and jogged over to present a black iron tiger tally to the northern camp sentry with both hands. Only then did the sentry realize Marshal Gu had come in person. An explosion seemed to echo through his head as he scrambled off to report to his superiors. Before leaving, however, he courageously snuck a look toward where Marshal Gu sat astride his horse in light pelt armor. The man was tall indeed, though not quite the 3-headed, 6-armed war god of rumors. The sentry's quick glance put him around 30 years of age, with a weather-beaten face and delicate features that seemed to run counter to his reputation as the peerless general who had led a cyclone of black iron to wipe out the 18 northern tribes. As if sensing his gaze, Gu Shun turned, his face inscrutable as he met the sentry's eyes. The sentry felt a chill lance through his chest. He scuttled off without a backward glance. It was said Marshal Gu had been ordained by the heavens to be a vanquisher of armies. As expected, he was no ordinary man. The northern barbarians transported to the capital were prisoners of war. Nevertheless, His Majesty ordered they be treated with all due respect. The Wolf King's heir and the goddess were sent to the Imperial Court of State Ceremonial's relay station for government officials, where they were served meals fit for a king. Then there were the grand assemblies and award ceremonies for the 3 Black Iron divisions. By the time Gu Shun concluded these matters and returned to his estate, it was late in the night. As he removed his armor, his vicious aura, ferocious enough to frighten off a malevolent ghost, seemed to soften. From the back, he looked no different from any noble official riding in carriages through the capital. Gu Shun patted the iron puppet standing guard at the front gates as he passed and sighed deeply, exhaustion deepening the lines of his face. His newly appointed personal guard, Huodan, 17 years old and still practically a child, had been eating sand with him on the northern border throughout the campaign. This was his first time in the capital, and he only wished he had a second pair of eyes as he trailed in the marshal's wake, looking this and that way. The stone spirit screen, the floral latticed windows, even the gas lamps hanging by the gate, everything about the Marquis estate was novel to this young country bumpkin. Gu Shun turned to housekeeper Wang and pointed a finger at Huodan. "Find this kid a spare room. Don't let him starve." "Yes, my lord." "Sir," Huodan hurried to ask, "don't you need me to stay with you?" The servant boys waiting behind housekeeper Wang snickered as Gu Shun smacked Huodan on the back of the head. "I'm going to Her Highness's quarters. What on earth would I need you for?" There was a princess's tent in the Black Iron Battalion's camp, But she hadn't accompanied Marshal Gu to the northern border this time. Huodan knew the eldest princess by reputation only. He had never seen her in person. To him, a princess was hardly different from an unattainable celestial maiden. At the words, Her Highness, his face flushed as red as a monkey's bottom. By the time he had mastered himself, Gu Shun had already walked away. Marshal Gu dismissed the servants as he made his way to the rear courtyard. When he reached the door, he tidied his robes, then respectfully said, Gu Shun begs an audience with Her Highness, the eldest princess. The old matron standing inside the door beamed. The Marquis is always so polite. Please come in. At this time in Great Liang, the eldest princess was the precious jewel of the imperial line. No other princess matched her in seniority, and the fact that she was highly capable elevated her status further. She was the last living descendant of the late Emperor Wu and the rightful holder of the Black Iron Tiger Tally. All of this ensured that she was a revered figure within the court, such that even His Majesty the Emperor respectfully called her auntie when he encountered her. Gu Shun patiently waited for all the meddlesome maidservants to step out before allowing himself to relax. The awe-inspiring severity vanished from his face, displaced by a look of shameless mischief as he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around the elderly princess's waist. I missed you so much, he murmured. If only I could kick out all these irrelevant busybodies. Tongar, come with me to the border next time. It's my turf there. No one will say a word if I want to ride double with you on my horse. The princess smiled. The marshal won't tire till he destroys his last scraps of dignity, I see. Gu Shun removed his outer robe and slipped behind the dividing screen to wash. When he stepped back out, still in a state of undress, he reached at once for the princess's hand, only to be shaken off. Stop fooling around, she said, voice low. Your son's here. Gu Shun's smile vanished. Sure enough, when he pulled back the bed curtains, he spied the little dumpling sprawled on his back sound asleep, taking up the entirety of the bed. What's the little brat doing here again? He said, scowling. Little Marquis Guyuan of the Marquis of Anding's estate had a wet nurse of his own, but the child had a peculiar temperament. He wasn't at all shy with strangers under ordinary circumstances and didn't fuss no matter who his caretakers or playmates were. But even at his tender age, the tot had a clear idea of whom he considered his family. He would take milk from his wet nurse, but he refused to acknowledge her as his mother. On one memorable occasion, the child had fled a whole gaggle of servant girls and old maids and slipped into the princess's room to hide under her bed. Only when the princess returned that evening was he finally dragged out. By then it was so late the princess hadn't the heart to send him back to his own quarters and had allowed him to stay the night. Since then, it was as if Guyuan had unlocked a new ability. He began pulling all sorts of cheap tricks to sleep in his mother's bed. Absence made the heart grow fonder. But just when his very fond parents were about to get reacquainted, this clueless and unfortunate child had wedged himself between them. Even if he was their own flesh and blood, it was still desperately uncomfortable. Gu Shun sucked in a breath and reached out to prod at his son's chubby cheek. After a few pokes, he discovered the boy's cheeks were wonderfully soft and tender. The feeling was addictive, and he continued prodding until the child flinched away. Little Guyuan instinctively burrowed back into his blankets, his face wrinkling as he whined. The eldest princess caught Marquis Gu's pesky hand. Are you that bored? Some dad you are. If he wakes up and starts fussing, are you going to coax him back to sleep? He's how old and still needs to be coaxed asleep? Gu Shun arched his slender brow in displeasure. Coaxed to sleep. The boy's too spoiled. But even as he said so, he smoothed a palm over Guyuan's forehead, covering his eyes lest he be disturbed by the faint glow of the gas lamps. The Marquis of Anding's hand was broad and steady, his palm a warm and stabilizing presence. Little Guyuan quickly settled down, slipping back into a deep slumber beneath its comforting weight. The princess chuckled. And what exactly do you call this? Gu Shun chuckled awkwardly as he searched for an excuse. I've no patience for the little brat's wailing, that's all. Patting her son gently over the blankets, the princess asked, How are things going on the northern border? With me and the Black Iron Battalion there, what could go wrong? There's nothing to worry about. Gushan's smile was touched with arrogance as he lay down on the bed with his legs outstretched. Curled up under the blankets, Guyun barely measured the length of his calf. This little brat. After all this time, he's still so tiny, Gushan thought idly. The little boy was the spitting image of the eldest princess. Gushan gazed down at his sleeping face, his eyes gentling. If you find life in the capital too trying, leave with me after the turn of the year. The northern border is a place His Majesty can't touch. Even if life is harsh, we'll be free. What about Xiao Shiliu? The princess asked. We'll bring him with us. It'll save everyone a load of trouble, seeing as no one in the estate dares to discipline him. Gushan stroked his son's hair and sighed. The little brat has all the luck. He looks so much like you. I haven't the heart to be ruthless with him, even when I ought to be. The princess had no idea what to say. Even she didn't care to know what Marshal Gu considered ruthless. After a moment of thought, Gushan stretched, then sat up to lean back against the side of the bed. The 16 nations of the western regions have come to the imperial court to pay their respects, and the Woku pirates in the East Sea have yet to develop into an enemy worth fearing. Now the barbarians beyond our northern border have surrendered. If nothing changes, we can expect at least a decade of peace. I plan to use it to recuperate, train our troops, and expand the Black Iron Battalion. After 10 years, there won't be a nation in the world that will dare incur the wrath of our armored cavalry. Tongar, when the time comes, let's return the Black Iron Tiger Tally to His Majesty, okay? The princess smiled sweetly at him. Does the marshal intend to lay down his armor and retire to the countryside? I'm afraid I don't know how to weave cloth, so you'll have to marry a concubine who does. Gushan tapped her lightly on the forehead. His gentle smile faded slightly. Those in high positions must avoid holding too much power. In the event that we really do master all our foreign enemies, holding the Black Iron Tiger Tally will only lead to His Majesty to find fault with me. Xiao Shiliu doesn't have what it takes to become a pillar of this nation. If we both take a step back, he'll have a wider path to walk in the future. What are you looking at? I'm looking at the famously hard-hearted marshal's earnest hopes for his son. Gushan coughed in embarrassment, then reached up to turn down the gas lamp. It's late. Hurry up and get some rest. Scoot this little marshal over a bit, Wait, don't squish him. Forget it. I'll just toss the little bastard out the window. Guyuan started awake with a sharp shiver. He lifted a hand to his eyes, blocking the thin bar of lamplight. For a moment, he felt lost, unsure where or when he was. You're finally awake, said a voice beside him, low and impatient. You slept so long you missed lunch. Come, get up. You can have some hot soup to tide you over for now. What do you want to eat? Finally, Guyuan came fully awake. Letting his eyelids drop again, he drawled, Anything is fine. It was the 3rd year of Taishu. Guyuan had been touring the south and visiting the garrisons. To make it back to the capital in time for the New Year's Day, he'd traveled by kite overnight without stopping to rest. Upon getting home, he had passed out the instant his head hit his pillow. It was already nearly dusk. For some reason, he dreamed the old Marquis had been blocking the light for him so he could sleep. What a strange dream. The only person he knew who would be so thoughtful was his dear emperor. Guyuan grabbed Changgung's hand and examined it playfully. Guyuan had held the Black Iron Tiger Tally for years. His hands had long become calloused and scarred, and he was no more the boy who had come up with all sorts of excuses to sneak into his mother's bed. His Majesty's hand showed traces of his martial arts training, and his fingers were lightly calloused from drawing his bow. Even so, he spent most of his time holding a brush. His fingers were slender and well-formed, his palms slightly cool, not at all like those of the man in Guyuan's dream. Why had his brain concocted such an outlandish scene? Still holding a memorial, Changgung turned to rest his chin on top of Guyuan's head. What's wrong? He murmured. Nothing, Guyuan said easily. Only that it's been ages since I last touched your Majesty's dragon claws. I missed them. The old Marquis using his hand to block the light? He must really have been dreaming. But the scene continued to gnaw at his mind. Perhaps because he had slept too long during the day, Guyun couldn't find sleep that night no matter how he tried. With one arm wrapped around Chang'eng and the other pillowed beneath his own head, he allowed his mind to drift in the soft darkness. Both his parents had died young. Guyun found himself struggling to remember what the eldest princess looked like. By comparison, his impression of the old marquis was much sharper, perhaps a consequence of all the time he'd spent glaring furiously at his father's face. He and his father had been like a pair of old nemesis. The Marquis was ruthless in his treatment of Guyun, and Guyun responded by doggedly refusing to beg for mercy, as if to do so would be to concede defeat. "What are you thinking about?" Chang'eng whispered, slightly nasal, as he shifted within the loop of Guyun's arm. "Did I wake you?" Guyun stroked his hand up the side of Chang'eng's face, pressing light fingers to his temple. There was no way Marshal Gu, master of romance, would say something so absurd as, "I'm thinking about my dad," while lying in bed with his lover. After a beat, he whispered back, "I was thinking, Your Majesty must be tired from working so hard lately. You're awfully well behaved tonight." When all was said and done, Guyun was still something of an elder to Chang'eng. Even if the nature of their relationship had changed, his instinct was to treasure and indulge Chang'eng more than anything else. Regardless of how shamelessly he behaved, when it came to matters of the bedroom, as Chang'eng's godfather, he felt self-conscious taking the initiative. Although he occasionally spoke like a rank scoundrel, he mostly yielded to Chang'eng in whatever he wanted. Picking up the note of suggestion in Guyun's words, Chang'eng jolted awake at once. He stared at Guyun, his gaze turning heated. But a thought seemed to occur to him, and he paused. With steely focus and held breath, he pressed his fingers to Guyun's wrist for several long seconds, checking his pulse. Finally, he tamped firmly down on his desires and said tightly, "You've had such a long and tiring journey, yet the first thing you do is provoke me. Are you trying to make yourself ill?" "I've missed you." Scalp prickling, Chang'eng mustered all his restraint to squeeze out, "I'm not in the mood." "Oh?" A pause. "In that case, what's that rubbing against me, Guyun asked innocently. "Shut up and sleep." "Shut up and sleep." A pair of veins popped into existence on Gu Shun's forehead. He was sorely tempted to toss the little meatball lying on his bed out the door. The eldest princess had been in poor health since giving birth to Guyun, and fell ill whenever the seasons began to turn. It was never serious, but she was always worried about getting Guyun sick and refused to let him stay in her room. In the interest of providing their child with a good example of fairness and equality, she rejected Marshal Gu's hopeful advances and kicked him out as well. Barred from entering, the little boy stood on tiptoe and clung to the windowsill, his eyes huge as he stared forlornly into the princess's room. Gushun's heart had softened at the sight. In a moment of weakness, he brought the kid to his own quarters, only to regret the impulse almost immediately. "Are you going to sleep or not?" Guyun burrowed beneath the blankets before poking his head out to bare his pearly milk teeth in his smile, entirely unaware of the ferocious Marshal Gu. "Fine." Gushun pinned the brat down with a broad hand before patting him awkwardly on the back. "How does your mom get you to fall asleep?" "She sings me a song," Guyun chirped brightly. "Nonsense. Your mother doesn't even know how to sing." Unabashed at having been so quickly exposed, the child continued his cheerful attempts to squirm free from beneath Marshal Gu's iron palm. Gushun regarded the tot in amazement. The little bastard's teeth had barely grown in, and he already had the gall to try to get one over on his old man. He didn't even blush as he lied, nor did he seem to fear Gushun. The audacity of this child! "I'll tell you a story if you behave," Gushun said. At this, Guyun at last lay his head down on the pillow, accepting his father's offer. Gushun hesitated, his face unreadable. He stiffly opened his mouth. "Once upon a time, there was a little dog." How could Marshal Gu possibly know how to tell a proper bedtime story? He racked his brain, making things up on the fly and sounding like he'd rather be dead than telling nursery tales. Droning on like an old monk reading scripture, he nearly put himself to sleep instead of the child. Guyun soon grew bored and began to wriggle again, whining all the while. Gushun spanked his little bottom. "Behave." Furious, Guyuan flipped over and sat up, working up to a torrent of tears. Gushan regarded him stonily and was shocked to discover the little brat already knew how to read people's body language. Upon realizing the tried and true tactics he employed against his mother were ineffective, the boy swallowed his tears back down without even trying to maintain the act. "I'll tell my mom on you," Guyuan declared. Gushan arched a brow. "Go right ahead. Your mom is my wife. See how far that gets you." The boy didn't quite know what a wife was, but he had a vague feeling Gushan had a point. He lapsed into a sullen silence. Gushan watched him warily. Something told him this brat wasn't going to take it lying down. Perhaps this was evidence of the intuitive bond between father and son. He was suddenly curious to see what this child would try next. Without further ado, he rolled Guyuan up in a blanket, stuffed him under his arm, and closed his eyes in feigned sleep. The child behaved himself for a while. He had much more patience than Gushan expected, but eventually he began to test his bonds with small wriggles. When no response came from his father, he inched closer to check whether his captor had fallen asleep. The child's soft breaths tickled Gushan's face and made his lips twitch with an urge to smile. "So sneaky. Is he going to scribble on my face?" Gushan wondered. After watching his father for a span, Guyuan called out, soft as a kitten's mew, "Are you asleep?" Gushan kept his eyes firmly closed. Guyuan giggled mischievously and squirmed free of his blanket. Scooting to the foot of the bed, he reached out to paw and scratch hard at the sole of Marshagoo's foot. The instant his father bolted upright, the brat rolled off the bed and slipped smoothly beneath it. Marshagoo was stunned beyond words. He realized he had underestimated this chubby dumpling. The little bastard hadn't settled for something so childish as drawing on his father's face. He had recognized at once that what Gushan most wanted was to sleep, so he directed all his efforts toward refusing to let him. He'd waited till his father had supposedly drifted off before striking a fatal blow, and even prepared an escape route in advance. Rolling up his sleeves, Gushan jumped down from the bed and crouched on the ground. "Get out here!" Guyuan shuffled further under the bed and gleefully pulled a face at him. Clad only in his inner garments, the commander-in-chief of the Black Iron Battalion squatted down in the middle of the night and faced off against a child across the barrier of a bedboard. "Are you coming out or not?" Guyuan merrily shook his head. Laughing in anger, Gushan beckoned to Guyuan. Softening his voice, he coaxed, "Come out now. Dad will tell you a story." Intrigued, Guyuan leaned forward to crawl out, but at the last moment, he thought better of it. Staring suspiciously at Gushan, he cried, "You spanked me!" The kid even knew how to negotiate terms of surrender. Gushan smiled. "I won't spank you anymore. Now, hurry up and come out." Guyuan, apparently appeased, began crawling out. Yet halfway through, he paused again, as if he'd suddenly recalled something. "I don't believe you." He was surprisingly difficult to fool, too. Gushan tucked his itching hand behind his back and lied like a wolf in sheep's clothing. "I promise I won't strike you. If I strike you, then I'm that little dog." After turning this over in his childish brain, Guyuan deemed the terms acceptable and was finally tricked into coming out. Gushan was on him at once, snatching him up like an eagle seizing a chick. "Filthy little monkey, Dad's not spanking you, just dusting you off," Gushan said with a menacing smile. A quarter of an hour later saw Guyuan howling with tears, having been thoroughly dusted with his father's iron palm. Satisfied, Gushan wrapped the tyke back in his blanket roll and set him down. Thinking back over the battle of wits that had just transpired, he realized the little brat had potential. He patted the sobbing dumpling on the head. "I'll tell you a story. Are you listening?" Guyuan poked his tear-dampened face out and glared at his father with mistrust. It was a moment before Gushan continued. "I'm going to tell you the story of Great Liang's military expedition on the northern border." "What's a Great Liang?" Guyuan asked in a watery voice. "Our nation of Great Liang extends from the Great Pass in the north to the offshore islands in the south, the vast mountains in the west, and the boundless sea in the east. A journey from the east to the west by horse takes months, and the sights along the way are each more wondrous than the next. The common folk make their homes all across our lands, ranging from the north to the south and living in harmony." His voice was no longer dull and flat. Although Guyun didn't quite understand everything, he listened with rapt attention, finally soothed to stillness. "Do you know what common folk means?" Gushan asked. Guyun hesitated, then shook his head. "It refers to millions of people. Men like your dad, women like your mom, kids like you, and old folks like Uncle Wang." Gushan smiled. "And the place where we live is called Great Liang. We have many good things here. We wear silk and woven cloth, ride steam-powered carriages, and eat. What do you like to eat?" "Meat," Guyun answered. Gushan eyed him before continuing. This child was far too easily satisfied. "But there's another place with a group of people who look different from us and are poorer than us. They have meat, but it's not enough to fill their bellies, and most of it is tough and dry." Gushan pried open Guyun's mouth and looked at his delicate milk teeth, then shook his head scornfully. "You definitely wouldn't be able to chew through it. And anyway, there's never enough. They don't grow grain, so the pastries and sweets you eat every day, they don't have any of that. Every day they starve. Do you know what starve means?" The little boy stared at him vacantly, clearly ignorant of the term. "They often traded with us for food," Gushan said, "but over time they grew dissatisfied. They thought what we gave was too little, so they sent their people here to take what they wanted by force." Guyun's eyes were round. He curled up and clung to the edges of his blankets, as if terrified someone might come take away his own meat and sweets. "This is why Great Liang must have iron armor and people like your dad," Gushan continued, "to ensure the peace of our nation." The child blinked. "Peace?" Gushan scooped him up and settled him against his broad and sturdy chest, his heart beating a slow and steady rhythm. He patted Guyun on the back and told him about peace and the Black Iron Battalion. He described the heavy armor that roared like beasts, the armored eagles that sliced through the sky, and the light pelts that could travel 1,000 kilometers in a single day. He recounted how the Black Iron Battalion had swept across the northern border and forced the wolves' surrender. At some point, Guyun fell asleep. Gushan glanced and saw that the rims of the little boy's eyes were slightly red. He had one of his claws fisted in his father's robes, as if about to stuff the cloth straight into his mouth. Gushan thought then, "Little brat, if you work hard and make something of yourself, our nation might yet remain in good order for another generation." The instant the notion occurred to him, he felt it was too fanciful to place such a heavy burden on the shoulders of this plump little dumpling. Scoffing at himself, he reached up to turn down the gas lamp. I'll simply let nature take its course." On this night, the iron-blooded Gushan's heart still harbored an indulgent wish for his only son, that he might grow up free and unfettered. That day, when court had adjourned, Guyun went neither to the northern camp nor to the Lingshu Institute. Instead, he returned home to the Marquis estate and headed to the training grounds, where the armory was located. Uncle Wang trailed behind him. "My lord, what are you looking for?" "I'm looking for a well, technically it's a stick." Guyun allowed the iron puppet creaking around the courtyard to pass before walking in. The Gu bloodline had produced a military leader in every generation as far back as they could remember. Their influence had peaked during Gushan's time, when the Marquis of Order had held the Black Iron Tiger Tally and rivaled the Emperor himself in power. The Marquis estate's armory contained all the family heirlooms and famous weapons Guyun's ancestors had collected over the years. The moment he stepped into the place, he was assailed by its chilling aura. The inner chamber was populated mostly with ancient swords, while the outer held weapons that incorporated the newer engine technology. Its denizens included veterans of the battlefield that had soaked in the blood of thousands, as well as virgin blades that had never touched a whetstone. All were neatly displayed in solemn, or malevolent, silence. Uncle Wang called over a handful of servants, carrying a large chest for Guyun's inspection. "This is everything our family has in storage. What kind of windslasher is the Marquis looking for?" "About 30 centimeters long." Guyun considered that, since Uncle Wang had watched him grow up, there was no shame in telling him. "Actually, it's not a real windslasher," Guyun said with a laugh. It's a hollow replica that was used as a toy. He coughed awkwardly. Honestly, I just thought about it for the first time in years myself. Don't worry if you can't find it. I suppose it's long gone. Oh, Uncle Wong's mind worked. That thing. It's still here. Give me a moment. I'll find it for you. He sent one of the servants to fetch a ladder, which he set beside a wooden cabinet containing a number of bows. The doddering old man was about to clamber up himself when Guyuan stopped him. Allow me. There's a little box at the top, explained Uncle Wong. Everything left from the Marquis's childhood should be in there. Guyuan dutifully climbed the ladder. Sure enough, an iron box squatted atop the cabinet. He brushed away the thick layer of dust and opened it, revealing a suit of tiny, toy-like armor with a helmet and vambraces stored inside. The armor wasn't truly wrought from black iron, but was very light and finely made. Guyuan had no idea he'd had these sort of toys as a child. He stood for a moment in stunned silence, sifting through his memories, but couldn't recall a time when he had played with these things. Aside from these, the pile of children's toys in the box contained a slingshot, a tiny steam-powered carriage, and the very wind slasher he sought, roughly 30 centimeters long. Guyuan carefully lifted out the hollow wind slasher. It was tiny in his hands, slim enough that he could easily hold it between 2 fingers and weighed hardly anything at all. He wiped away dust to reveal the characters Guyuan etched in stark relief at its base, followed by another line of text that said, Xiao Shi Liu. The writing was not his own elegant script. The characters here were deeply carved, absent any extraneous flourish to the point they seemed almost brutal. Each and every soldier of the Black Iron Battalion had their names engraved onto their wind slashers. Guyuan had thought that, despite being a commander-in-chief, he was the only one who'd never performed this rite. But, to his growing surprise, his name had been carved here all this time. He was completely gobsmacked. Here was generally evidence that proved his vague and fragmented memories were based in truth. Looking down at the little thing, a scene floated to the surface of his mind. Little Guyuan stood on tiptoe, clinging to his father's arm. His father was strong. Even with one arm occupied supporting his son, the other didn't so much as shake as it continued etching the characters for Guyuan. When he was done, he showed the child his handiwork. Now that your name's been carved on it, it's yours. The little boy couldn't yet read, but he nevertheless carefully inspected the inscription and traced the characters with an earnest little finger. Xiao Shi Liu? Huh? Wasn't there a character missing? Guyuan burst into laughter. It says Guyuan. Son, how do you expect to step onto the battlefield with a wind slasher labeled Xiao Shi Liu? Are you trying to make your enemies laugh until they croak? Guyuan couldn't see what was so funny, but after thinking it over, he said magnanimously, Guyuan is fine, I guess, but I want to add Xiao Shi Liu at the bottom. That day, Marshal Gu's guffaws could be heard a courtyard away. The old Marquis had it specially commissioned from the Lingshu Institute back in the day, Uncle Wong said, squinting at the hollowed-out iron rod in Guyuan's hands. It doesn't have the inner workings, but the outer shell is a scaled-down version of a real wind slasher. Guyuan ran his fingers carefully over the old toy and said nothing. His impression of his father had always been that he was cold and unyielding. The swords he shoved into Guyuan's hands in his childhood had all been wetted with real blood. Likewise, the iron puppets that were his sparring partners were genuinely capable of shattering his bones or even killing him. The cruelty of the world drove him to do what he did. The old Marquis had few good choices. Please don't blame him, Uncle Wong said quietly. Had he spoken these words to Guyuan 20 years ago, even if he had broken them down and explained his reasoning bit by bit, Guyuan would never have listened or understood. But now he was the same age his father had been back then. He could extrapolate a whole sequence of events, with all of its causes and effects, from Uncle Wong's single vague sigh. Guyuan had wanted to retire after pacifying the nation, but the Yuanhe emperor, mesmerized by the barbarian consort's beauty, suspected his motives as the bearer of the black iron tiger tally. Any emotion, deeply felt, could spur action. Ferocious beasts might fall to their knees in sorrow. Vicious fiends bend to smell the flowers in joy. The fearless might advance bravely, and the cowardly resort to frenzied extremes. The Yuanhe emperor was deeply suspicious, and what was more, he was impatient, unwilling to wait for Gushan to realize his long-held dream of a peaceful and orderly nation. Once he took matters into his own hands and promoted the barbarian goddess to the rank of noble consort, the fragile balance between sovereign and subject began to deteriorate. The emperor repeatedly moved to curtail the power of military leaders, while despicable individuals in the imperial court took their cue from his example and made their own plans, culminating in the brazen attack on the Black Iron Battalion. Gushan was left with no choice but to harden his heart against his cosseted son. Perhaps he had foreseen the chaos that awaited them in the future, or perhaps he merely saw his own fate too clearly. He had wished to cut a path to freedom for Guyuan, for the Black Iron Battalion, for the Gu family, and for the vast territories of Great Liang. Had it been Guyuan in the old Marquis's place, Guyuan shook his head. He couldn't guess whether he would be so ruthless. As he carefully replaced the wind slasher inside the box, he remembered an idle conversation he'd had with Chang'eng. Me? I was never afraid of my dad as a kid. If anything, I was afraid I wouldn't be able to beat him. Guyuan furrowed his brow in confusion. Huga'ar was a tiny woman. Even if her methods were cruel, you dwarfed her by the time you were 12 or 13. Why did you fear her so? Chang'eng considered this for a moment. I suppose you and I are quite different this way. That's right. You were a moody child with a gentle disposition. A thought occurred to Guyuan. Were you ever afraid of me? What? Chang'eng started in surprise. Then he burst into laughter. Why on earth would I be afraid of you? He left unsaid. I was way too busy thinking of ways to take care of you. Compared to Huga'ar, I was a much sterner parent, wasn't I? Asked Guyuan, displeased. Are you trying to tell me that, in your eyes, this marshal inspires less terror than a pint-sized barbarian girl? Chang'eng smiled. Even if you were some all-powerful deity winging through the sky, you wouldn't hurt a hair on my head. How could I be afraid of you? No child will fear someone who loves them. No child will fear someone who loves them. Guyuan's heart stuttered in his chest as he remembered Chang'eng's words. He had always presumed he never feared his father simply due to his innate nature. He had always been the type to rise to the occasion and become stronger in the face of overwhelming adversity. Yet it turned out that, buried deep in his faintest memories, there had always been this little hollowed-out wind slasher, protecting him with its indomitable spirit. Guyuan hopped down from the ladder, feeling glum. I understand. I'll personally burn some money for the old man during the Qingming festival this year. The world of mortals. After a difficult year, the four borders of Great Liang were finally stabilized. The emperor, with Guyuan's explicit approval, commenced a round of military reform. It was around this time that Shun Yi finally mustered up the courage to present his letter of resignation to His Majesty. After listening to his reasons, Chang'eng set the memorial aside and instructed Shun Yi to go home and think things over. General Shun's memorial was filled with fanciful excuses. In reality, the reason for his resignation was obvious. He wanted to go home and get married. Given the complicated nature of his intended's family situation, he had guessed she was unlikely to involve herself with an official of the imperial court. Thus, Shun Yi had elected to relinquish his post, find steady work in some civilian industry, and, with whatever monies his family would provide, marry into his bride's family instead of the other way around. Back at home, Chang'eng asked, Ziqi, do you think old Master Shun knows about this? Hard to say, Guyuan said. But anyway, it's not like his dad can control him either. Shun Jiping seemed like a gentle and eloquent person, a soft man who could be easily pushed around. But any examination of his actions would quickly spoil this notion. Every decision he made was shockingly controversial. Despite spending half his life defying social norms, the vast majority were still under the misconception that he was a dependable man. He was the perfect embodiment of the expression, "One can't judge a book by its cover." Throughout the years, his aspirations had grown stranger and stranger. Saddled with a son like this, it was small wonder old Master Shun had thrown up his hands and turned to immortal cultivation. Guyuan sighed. "Forget it. I'll go talk to Shun Jiping in a few days." Changgeng's face clouded over. He wants to talk to him again? One could only imagine what ancient memories these two idiots would drag up once they started talking. When the rabble of military ruffians gathered around one big table to eat and drink, Changgeng knew Guyuan only pretended to behave in his presence, but he had some faith the man wouldn't completely let loose and indulge in food and wine behind his back. Still, he would undoubtedly end up staying out all night at the northern camp instead of coming home, which Changgeng found deeply irritating. Thus, with Guyuan none the wiser, Changgeng promptly penned a letter to Chen Qingshu laying out the situation. He wrote with utmost earnestness, "We write to you out of both public and private concerns. Our nation lies in ruins waiting to be revitalized. We require all the manpower we can master. It would be a great pity for a trusted official like General Shun to step down from his post at this juncture." Of course, Shun Yi had never brought up the matter of his resignation with Chen Qingshu herself and had been acting entirely on his own initiative. Upon receiving the emperor's letter, Chen Qingshu said not a word to anyone but returned to her home in Shanxi the very same day. Once she had sorted the whole thing out with her family with maximum efficiency, she flew back on one of the great condors that was still conducting test runs between the Northwest and the capital. When she at last tracked down Shun Yi, she said bluntly, "I'm the head of the Chun family. Why didn't you come to me about your concerns over my family?" Shun Yi had no good answer. When Guyuan heard what had happened, he laughed for a good 6 months. Half a year later, military commanders throughout the nation sent letters congratulating General Shun on finally finding a prominent family into which he could marry himself, and requesting that the Marquis of Anding represent all who couldn't attend the merry occasion by arranging a series of good pranks for the newlyweds on their wedding night. Guyuan, that gleeful sower of discord, gladly agreed. He began his preparations days in advance, thinking up a dozen new ways to torture Shun Yi while helping the Shun household prepare for the impending nuptials. Shun Yi had spent half his life battling wits with this goo bastard and had reached the point where he could spot a rotten idea brewing solely from the slant of his marshal's evil smile. In the interest of self-preservation, he gathered reinforcements in advance, requesting a private audience with His Majesty the Emperor. "Your Majesty," Shun Yi said, entirely businesslike, "while I was organizing my personal effects the other day, I recalled that Marshal Gu once entrusted 4 letters to me when we were fighting on the Jiangnan front lines. Among them, 2 were personal letters addressed to your Majesty. I sent one of them to you back then, but there's another that remains in my care. I've no idea of its contents. Would your Majesty like to have it?" Changgeng guessed instantly what had happened. Guyuan must have prepared a whole stack of dispatches to reassure everyone should anything go awry during battle. The unsent missive very likely contained Guyuan's final farewell. He hesitated only briefly. "In that case, we'll thank you for the trouble, General Shun." "It's no problem at all." Shun Yi rubbed his hands together and continued, "Your Majesty, this subject has one other favor he would ask of you." Containing Guyuan was a simple matter now that Shun Yi had finally grasped the proper method. All Changgeng had to do was tell Guyuan, "It hasn't been easy for Miss Chun these years. She just wants to get married properly." Guyuan banished the task entrusted to him by his army brothers to the back of his mind without a moment's hesitation. Not only did he behave himself, he even loosened his own purse strings and commissioned a special batch of fireworks through the Lingshu Institute's civilian-facing enterprise. When the auspicious evening arrived, the sky over the Shun estate in the capital and the northern camp in the outskirts erupted in a dazzling display of fireworks that lit the entire city. But even without anyone making trouble on purpose, Shun Yi was a lightweight. After touring the hall and toasting the guests at each table, he was dead drunk. Holding a pair of cups and slurring his speech, he made his way over to Guyuan. He had a belly full of words, but all he managed was a belch. He suddenly realized they were in full view of a crowd. He had meant to say many things, yet all were difficult to voice. For a moment, he merely stood and stared at Guyuan in a tipsy gaze. Guyuan sighed. Ji Pingxiong, your eloquence, as always, is unmatched. He relieved Shen Yi of the cups, clinked them together, and downed both in rapid succession on Shen Yi's behalf. Ever since he had begun helping Shen Yi prepare for the wedding, Guyuan had been feeling inexplicably happy. It was different from the sudden, momentous joy of being named Zhongyuan in the imperial examinations or emerging victorious from a fierce battle. There was no particular thing he could point to as the reason for his happiness. It was merely that everything he saw was pleasing to the eye, a source of unalloyed delight. Shen Yi threw an arm around his friend's shoulder and hugged him fiercely. He looked like he might cry, then managed to twist his expression into an ugly smile, as if he had no idea how to express himself. Are you happy now? Guyuan asked softly. Shen Yi didn't know what to say, so he nodded his head furiously. The first time he'd followed this man into battle, he could never have imagined a day would come when he would stand together at his wedding. Live a good life, Guyuan said, and try not to talk your wife's ear off. Torn between laughter and tears, Shen Yi pounded his fist twice against Guyuan's back. All right, stop wiping your snot on my robes. You mustn't keep your bride waiting, Guyuan said with a light shove. I'll keep them out, so go on. Shen Yi took 2 steps away before sending a glance behind him. Sure enough, with Guyuan standing there like a spear to thrust in the ground, no one dared come up and pester him. He felt a ripple of melancholy then. Over the course of his military career, Guyuan had guarded the gates of their nation, various cities, and even the imperial palace. Now, this absurdly overqualified man was standing guard over the gates of his nuptial chamber, and, what was more, he looked delighted at the honor. Shen Yi's eyes stung. Remorse welled up in his heart. He hurried back in a flurry of steps and came clean. Zishi, that sealed letter you wrote in Jiangnan, I gave it to His Majesty. Anyway, I'm off. Guyuan was speechless. Despite bullying Shen Yi since they were kids, he had gone out of his way to treat the man well on his wedding day, only to suffer such a dramatic betrayal. What was this but karmic retribution? As the lively wedding drew to a close, Guyuan braced himself to return to the Marquis estate. His Majesty's attendance at the wedding was a sign of great favor, but staying too long would make things awkward for everyone. Chang'e had left after bestowing a gift upon the couple and sipping a single cup of wine. By the time Guyuan arrived home, he had long been awaiting in their room with the lamps lit. Guyuan had spent the journey home concocting a rotten idea. He called for a servant to bring him a pot of wine and splashed the contents on his lapels and sleeves so he smelled like a walking distillery. Only then did he dismiss the servants and stumble his way through the door. Chang'e was bent over some papers, reading by lamplight. Startled by the sudden gust of wind and stench of alcohol, he looked up with a slight frown in time to see Guyuan trip over the threshold and tumble into the room. Shoving aside his reading, he dashed over to catch him, shivering at the touch of his frozen hands. The Marquis was an energetic person, but no matter how hot the weather, his hands and feet were always ice cold. The medicine he'd taken for decades had harmed his body, but he never uttered a word of complaint, and so Chang'e didn't dare express concern either. He simply watched over him with utmost care. On the other hand, Guyuan had gradually let go of his habit of wearing only thin, unlined robes in the middle of winter. It was through these sorts of small compromises that the two gradually reached a tacit understanding of one another. Chang'e tried to take hold of Guyuan's hands, but Guyuan refused to cooperate, acting the part of a lolling drunkard with remarkable skill and leaving His Majesty completely helpless to stop him. Zishi! Heavens! How much did you drink? Did you lift all your prohibitions today? Guyuan groaned softly as he slumped heavily against Chang'e and groped at his waist. Seizing Chang'e's moment of distraction as he dealt with Guyuan's wandering hands, Guyuan pushed him back against the writing desk and cast a surreptitious glance over Chang'e's shoulder. Scanning the contents of the desk, he spotted that letter he had completely forgotten about. It was still sealed. Cheering at his stroke of luck, Guyuan doubled down on his performance. He tripped on purpose and overturned the writing desk, sending brushes and paper scattering across the ground and nearly knocking Chang'eng off his feet in the process. Struggling to hold Guyuan upright, Chang'eng dragged the unruly man to the bed, sweating from the exertion. But this drunk refused to behave himself and lie down. "Beautiful, don't go," he murmured, clinging to Chang'eng. A vein throbbing at his temples, Chang'eng demanded, "Who are you calling out to?" "Chang'eng, my darling," Guyuan said, hoarse and slightly slurred. Chang'eng's scalp prickled at the sound. Guyuan spread his arms wide. "Come and spend the night with your Yifu." Chang'eng was a naturally tidy person and very much wanted to turn back and sort out the mess around the table. But with Guyuan tempting him like this, he couldn't bear to do it. After a lengthy battle between his desire for cleanliness and his desire for Guyuan, His Majesty surrendered to the force of the latter. He climbed onto the bed, snuffed the gas lamp, and yanked the bed curtains shut. The next day, when Chang'eng returned to his senses and bent to tidy the scattered papers, he discovered the letter, which he hadn't made his mind up about opening, was missing from the miscellany around his desk. Only then did he realize a certain someone had taken advantage of his lust-addled mind. Guyuan's ability to act dumb and evade questions was second to none. His mouth was more tightly sealed than a black carapace's gold tank, and he refused point-blank to admit to the existence of any such letter. Shunyi, the only other person who knew of the missive, had a guilty conscience. He refused to appear as a witness and spent several days playing dead. Despite pursuing the matter for over half a year, Chang'eng never did learn the whereabouts or contents of the letter. Over time, he gradually stopped brooding about it. In hindsight, it was his initial hesitation to open the envelope that had provided Guyuan his window of opportunity. Perhaps it was simply ordained by the heavens that he and that unsent letter were never to cross paths. Besides, with the author of the letter still alive and well to scheme against him, what need was there for him to read such heartbreaking words? Chang'eng decided it was fine to believe Guyuan's nonsense just this once. As far as he was concerned, the letter had never existed. Peace and prosperity. Whether the Crown Prince Li Zhang was a fortunate or unfortunate person was difficult to say. He was the child of the late Longan Emperor and his Empress, the legitimate heir, but not the eldest son. He was preceded by an ambitious elder brother, and history indicated that, upon reaching adulthood, he was bound to embark on a life-or-death struggle for the throne with his brother, pulling their mothers into a fight for the emperor's favor. The crown prince was gentle and quiet by nature. The gentleness came from his grandfather. The quiet came from his mother. Neither trait was valued in a ruler. His empress mother was sickly and prone to fits of nerves. She hailed from a family with no influence in court and had few personal ambitions and even less of a backbone. In this regard, she perfectly suited the Longan Emperor Li Feng's preferences. She was crowned empress because she held his imperial favor, but failed to unearth any hidden reservoir of willpower even after her ascent. Compared to Consort Lu and her son, the eldest prince, it seemed her greatest destiny was to become the unfortunate victim of harem schemes. But fate is never so predictable a thing. When the young crown prince Li Zhang was a scant 6 or 7 years of age, the peace he'd known until then was shattered and the nation fell into turmoil. Living deep in the palace as he did, Li Zhang's most vivid memories of those difficult years of war were that there was a year when his allowance was especially meager. And at the start of that summer, the capital was as hot as a furnace. The skies boiled with purple smoke in the west, and everyone within and without the palace walls had buzzed with anxiety. The faces of the palace maids and eunuchs had been solemn as they bustled in and out. He didn't see his father at all during those days. Confined to his mother's bedside as she lay sick in her chambers, he would often wake from his dreams in the middle of the night and overhear the servants talking in lowered voices. Their conversation never strayed far from the war. The crown prince was too young then to understand what the adults spoke about, but he remembered the topic was always accompanied by his mother's quiet sobs. As the young Li Zhang slowly grew up and began to understand the world around him, so did Great Liang's situation begin to improve. Later, there was a scandal in the court and Consort Lu's looming faction fell apart overnight. The Lu clan was charged with treason, and Consort Lu was stripped of her position and sent to the cold palace. Li Zheng's brother, the eldest prince, never recovered from this blow. For a stretch of time, the Eastern Palace became a golden goose everyone wanted to claim. This was the first moment in which the Crown Prince began to comprehend, in his childish way, the ebb and flow of power, as inexorable as the shifting tides. He decided he didn't like it. His imperial tutor hadn't yet reached these distasteful topics in the sage's texts he taught, but perhaps the young prince drew on some innate sensitivity that exceeded his physical years. He grew uneasy. To him, change meant upheaval. If there was a time when your doorstep was as busy as a marketplace, there too would come a time when it was deserted and left for sparrows to roost. The long-gone emperor was not blessed with many children. The eldest prince was a disgrace, and the third prince was young and born to a mother from a lowly family. Everyone thought of Li Zheng as the apparent heir, the most favored child in all of Great Liang. But before the boy himself could be infected with this fantasy, he watched his father die in a riot before his very eyes. On that day, surrounded by clashing soldiers, the young crown prince had clutched his fourth uncle's hand. He still saw himself as a child, and he witnessed the true meaning of power with a child's clear eyes. To the rest of Great Liang, the new emperor took the throne, marking the start of a new era in reign. To the young crown prince, residing deep within the palace, his entire world collapsed. The empress was a timid woman. She urged him to ingratiate himself with his fourth uncle. Henceforth, their fates as a widow and fatherless child would rest wholly upon his uncle's kindness. None of the officials could say how long he could expect to keep his title as crown prince. Li Zheng used to love being around his uncle Li Min, but in those days after he took the throne, he felt an oppressive pressure around his fourth uncle. His amiable and learned youngest uncle transformed overnight into His Majesty the Emperor, and he had to call his uncle by an entirely different title. Every day, the little crown prince braced himself to listen to political discussion he only half understood while appraising eyes weighed on him from all sides. Then, he braced himself again to pay his respects to his imperial uncle before returning to the Eastern Palace and bracing himself to listen to his mother's worried ramblings. His mother was nowhere near as capable as Consort Lu. She hadn't a single idea of her own and transferred the unbearable pressure of their position entirely onto her son. All she had to offer were empty admonitions that he must make something of himself. What exactly he should make of himself, what kind of person she wished him to become, she had absolutely no idea. Every person faced their own great challenges in youth. Guyun's challenge was the scattered Black Iron Battalion, and the Taishu Emperor Li Min's challenge was the frightful curse of the Wu'er. The young crown prince Li Zheng's challenge was undoubtedly his own uncertain future. Guyun had had thousands of wind slashers and generations of ancestors venerated in the Gu family's ancestral hall standing behind him, and Chang'e had had a young godfather watching over and guiding him. Li Zheng, by contrast, was surrounded by nothing but an endless haze of terror. There was no one to chart a path for him to take. In the autumn of the 4th year of Taishu, after the first frost, Li Zheng's empress mother passed away suddenly amid the boundless fear and anxiety that was her life. The emperor tasks the Ministry of Rites with arranging a lavish funeral. The 15-year-old crown prince had transformed from a quiet child into a young man who grew more taciturn by the day. During the wake, Chang'e dismissed the attendants and strolled into the room. Before Li Zheng could rise to salute him, Chang'e placed a hand on his shoulder. Li Zheng didn't insist. At his mother's urging, he'd for years poured his energy into learning his fourth uncle's preferences. He knew his uncle didn't like when others insisted on etiquette in private. "Your Majesty?" Chang'e gave him a look. The youth abashedly corrected himself. "Uncle." After offering him his condolences, Chang'e turned and paid his respects to the sister-in-law he hadn't met more than a handful of times in his life with perfect etiquette. He had risen again when the young crown prince, his recently changing voice cracking, spoke up beside him. "This subject has neither talent nor virtue, and cannot meet the demands of a position of power. Uncle, please strip me of my title as heir. Chang'eng frowned, looking up at him. His nephew's profile wasn't as imposing and dignified as his father's. It was too delicate. Li Zheng's face was pale and his frame was slight, his features shadowed by a lingering gloom. It was true that he didn't have the bearing of an imperial scion. His own words seemed to have frightened him. An anxious look stole over his face. By chance, a stiff breeze blew in through the cracked open door to the ancestral hall, and the ornaments hanging below the steam-powered lamps clinked and collided with the memorial tablet placed on display, knocking it over. The crown prince shuddered. With no change in expression, Chang'eng stood and respectfully set the memorial tablet to rights. He waved away the panicked palace attendants who had rushed in at the clatter and turned to his nephew. The imperial tutor said your studies are progressing well. What brought this on? Li Zheng lowered his head, afraid to speak. After a pause, Chang'eng continued. When you were younger, you often chased after me, asking all kinds of questions. I even wove straw grasshoppers for you to play with. Why have you grown so distant these years? Li Zheng had no good answer. He mumbled. There is a difference between a ruler and his subjects. This subject, On reflection, Li Zheng hadn't required anything from his youngest uncle back then. He'd simply liked him. So he had no reservations showing him affection. But these last years, although he still lived in the palace, he'd always felt that he was living beneath someone else's roof and relying on someone else's charity. When he spoke to his uncle now, there was an obsequiousness to his words and a note of caution in his actions. The relationship was too different. One look into Chang'eng's eyes told Li Zheng that his fourth uncle, who had saved this nation from the verge of collapse, saw everything as clearly as his reflection in a mirror. He felt more and more ashamed of himself. Stripping an heir of his title is no minor matter, Chang'eng replied, his tone placid. The nation has its laws. This isn't something you or I can decide on a whim. Li Zheng's face went red. It seemed he had been overthinking things. If there are certain things you feel you can't say to me, Chang'eng continued, you can speak to the Marquis of Anding. He'll be leaving the capital next month to carry out military inspections on all 4 borders. If you're interested, why not ask him to bring you along for a look? Chang'eng chuckled at Li Zheng's look of surprise. When I was your age, I was also horribly confused. I had a big fight with my guardian at the time. That is, the Marquis of Anding. I ran away from home and traveled the entirety of Great Liang with Great Master Liao Zhen and old General Zhong. I visited many places and I saw how the common people toiled for a living, as well as how villains and bandits ran rampant. Once you've seen enough of the vast sorrows and joys of the world, of life and death, partings and reunions, the worries stuffed inside your own heart seem small in comparison. No matter how little the Crown Prince understood about the workings of the nation, he knew the weight of the Marquis of Order, keeper of the Black Iron Tiger Tally, held in the military and in court. When he was young, he had been awfully curious about this legendary hero and had nagged and pleaded with him for samples of his calligraphy. Later, he was too afraid to act so presumptuously. When his mother was alive, she had kept him sealed carefully away in the palace and forbidden him from associating with court officials, terrified her son would overstep somewhere or make himself a nuisance to the new emperor. Thus, Li Zheng had never again visited the Marquis estate. Don't be afraid. We adored you when you were little. Do you remember? When Chang'eng spoke of Gu Yun, his expression unwittingly softened and a gentle smile spread over his face. The Crown Prince didn't comprehend whom he was talking about at first. Marshal Gu? Chang'eng strolled off toward the doors of the ancestral hall. After a stunned moment, the Crown Prince hurried after him. Seeing that this uncle and nephew wished to speak in private, the attendants swiftly retreated to both sides. The newly ascended young emperor walked in front, hands clasped behind his back, and spoke frankly to Li Zheng. I have no other candidates in mind for my heir. Someday in the future, I intend to pass the throne to you. By then, this will be a different country. When you sit upon this throne, you may find that the word of this nation's most honored ruler is no longer the last. The court, and even the entire world, will operate according to their own principles and the law above their heads. Ruler and subject and citizen, will check and balance each other. You may, someday, find yourself feeling like no more than a venerated puppet. This kind of talk was too radical. Li Jung froze in shock. Chang'eng tilted his head and looked at him. I wonder if you can accept ruling a nation like this. Li Jung began. You needn't answer now. Chang'eng smiled and pressed a palm to the top of the youth's head. Go see outside the world first, and come back once you're sure. If you really can't do it, I can adopt another child from the clan. Don't worry so much. Chang'eng made to walk off on his own. He had only come to show his face at the wake. He had no intention of staying in the palace overnight. You're Uncle, Li Jung called after him. Don't you want a child of your own? I've reached my final destination. I have no more regrets in life or in death. I don't need to leave any child of my blood behind. Chang'eng paused, then shook his head and laughed at the confused look on Li Jung's face. You wouldn't understand even if I told you. You'll get it when you're older. Half a month later, the Taishu emperor skillfully brushed aside all objections and granted the crown prince's request to accompany the Marquis of Anding on his inspection tour of the four borders. Li Jung spent 3 months at Guyuan's side, traveling every corner of the nation by air, water, and steam locomotive. He must have gotten a taste for it. Afterward, he continued to find excuses to leave the capital, spending more than half of each year outside the palace. 3 years later, when Li Jung turned 18, he visited the former Prince Yan estate, now the Imperial Manor, and spent an entire night conversing with Chang'eng. He wore his uncle down until Chang'eng finally conceded to let him take a bevy of guards and join the seafaring merchant convoy led by young Master Du, traveling to even more distant lands beyond the sea. This merchant convoy was perhaps more than it seemed. It was escorted by several dozen sea dragon ships and dragonettes, and aside from young Master Du and his entourage, the crown prince was also joined by elite sailors selected from Great Liang's navy, as well as a group of experts from the Linyuan pavilion working under Cao Chunhua and Liao Zhen. In addition to goods for trade, they carried letters of credence and terms for negotiating treaties with foreign nations. They traveled from east to west, sailed the 7 seas, and only returned home 5 years later. Upon Li Jung's return, he often joked that his mediocre talents and average intelligence would never rank among the most outstanding of the House of Li, but out of all of them, it was truly he who had roamed the farthest. In the 18th year of Taishu, Guyuan returned the black iron tiger tally to the throne and requested to retire. Several months later, the crown prince Li Jung accepted the throne from his venerated uncle. He abolished the practice of era names, established a new calendar that would be accurate across all 7 seas, and sailed ahead into a new era of reform that had found its footing after 18 years of fumbling. For so long as the mountains and rivers remained unchanged, peace reigned over the land. A depth of affection. Shen Yi's little daughter, Shen Yan, was born at the tail end of summer when her elder brother, Chen An, was 8 years old. Neither the Shen nor the Chen family counted many members among their households, so a child was a major source of celebration. An infant was taxing enough, and the endless stream of social calls that followed might push anyone to fantasize about dropping everything and running away. Being called upon by friends was one thing, but then there were endless court sycophants come to capitalize upon the opportunity for flattery, the Jianghu wanderers who wished to strengthen ties with the miracle doctor's clan. Chen Qingshu was still in confinement and couldn't meet with guests, and Shen Yi was a people-pleaser who struggled to deal with everyone on his own. Thus, on the day of the little girl's 3rd-day bathing ceremony, Guyuan showed up with a menacing escort of 24 black steeds and light-armored cavalrymen to personally ward against social nuisances. Black Hawks landed at the 4 corners of General Shen's estate in perfect synchrony, startling the birds that had been flying over the residence into swerving in an abrupt detour. Guyuan marched inside brazenly as any bandit and tossed his helm to a nearby servant before casting his eyes around the room. I was in such a hurry, he laughed. I didn't even have the time to remove my armor. But look, I made it in time to celebrate this joyous occasion with my venerated companions. Here, I'll drink 3 cups as punishment. Hey, my friend there, why are you hiding up in the rafters? Come down. Let's have a good time together. Under the Marquis's watchful eye, the Shun estate returned to its usual peaceful state in short order. Seeing that all the busybodies had fled, Guyuan whistled for the Black Hawks to come down. The Black Crows removed their helmets, revealing themselves to be not Guyuan's personal guards, but a few of their old comrades from the Black Iron Battalion. The soldiers gave Shun Yi their hearty congratulations as they followed him into the hall amid rowdy laughter. Spotting the young Chun An hovering by the doorway, Guyuan scooped him up with one arm and tossed him into the air. You're a big brother now, little squirt. Are you excited? Uncle Gu! Arms around Guyuan's neck, Chun An slid down his light armor and muttered something, but the exuberance of the soldiers drowned the boy's voice. Guyuan didn't notice. He patted the child on the head and strode inside to remove his armor. He was going to meet the baby later, and it wouldn't do to scare her. The way he saw it, becoming an older brother through no effort of one's own was an excellent deal. Why wouldn't a child be excited? Guyuan would have given his mother a few extra cow toes every year for the gift of a little brother or sister to play with. Chun An shuffled after him out of habit, then froze again on the spot. Every uncle mussed his hair on the way in, passing him by. To an 8-year-old child, these soldiers were much too big and tall. He had to crane his neck just to see their faces. None of the adults glanced down as they joked around with each other, so little Chun An often felt as if he had been abandoned out of sight. Somehow, the feeling was especially strong tonight. He wasn't excited. In fact, his heart felt like lead in his chest. But the whole house sparkled with a celebratory atmosphere, and his upset seemed entirely illogical. Chun An stared down at the toes of his little boots until he felt his eyes begin to sting. A hand settled lightly on the back of his head. Who is it now? Chun An stared at the ground in hot frustration. All the guests today were his parents' friends, so it was fine if he wasn't polite. Besides, this was just another cursory pat before an uncle went on their way. But after a long while, the hand never left his head. The cool scent of mint and medicinal herbs rose from the man's sleeve in the summer heat, coiling around the two of them. Chun An looked up and nearly jumped out of his skin in fright. You're Chang'eng, in casual clothing today, gave him a look. After a moment, Chun An let his head droop and muttered, Uncle Lee. A few steps away, the hall was dazzlingly lit, festive as a New Year's celebration. The soldiers jostled elbows and teased their comrade, now the proud father of both a son and a daughter. Chang'eng didn't rush over to join them. He stood with little Chun An in the small courtyard where the ancient trees of the Shun estate blocked both the lantern and the moonlight. A pair of shadows, one long and one short, stood in the shelter of their branches. You're not happy? Chun An shook his head in instinctive denial, then paused, letting his head hang in a tacit admission. This child, if Guyuan was to be believed, his temperament was much like Shun Yi's when he was younger, sensitive and apt to quietly overthinking things. Chang'eng couldn't say he saw the resemblance. Perhaps General Shun had made a mistake in his youth hanging around with that Gu bastard all day. Whatever he had been like originally, stepping into the vicious cycle of getting in trouble, ending up the scapegoat, and exploding in anger had caused him to grow up malformed. Are you afraid your mom and dad will only care about your little sister now and won't have any time for you? That's not it. I'm their son. They won't forget me, Chun An said, quiet. My sister is just a baby. Of course she needs more attention. When I was born, my uncles must have celebrated like this too. His words were mature and sensible. Even as an 8-year-old child, he would have seemed more grown up than every soldier in the house, if not for how he tugged dejectedly on Chang'eng's sleeve as he continued. I just... Chang'eng softly finished. Oh, you're just a little lonely. Chun An murmured his assent. He tilted his head to listen to the gathering inside the hall, then said, morose, "It seems like I'm the only one who's like this. Uncle Lee, am I too petty? This isn't the conduct of a man of character." "Hey!" Changung had rapped him lightly on the forehead. "Get taller than my chest before you worry about being a man of character." Changung laughed. "No two people are the same. For some people, it isn't their nature to dwell on such things. But in this, you and I are quite similar." Chun-An looked up at him with wide eyes. "I never lived with my birth parents when I was little, so I don't know what it's like to have a sibling. But when I saw the people I cared about with other close friends, it always made me a bit uncomfortable," Changung said slowly. He raised his palm level with the top of Chun-An's head. "I was like that when I was as tall as you, and I'm sometimes like that even now." Although Chun-An was young, he knew who Changung was. He would never dare accuse Uncle Lee of not being a man of character. "Then what do I do?" Inside, Guyuan had likely realized Changung should have arrived by now. He diverted his attention from the cacophony of clinking cups and shot a glance or two out the door. Changung took a half step out from behind the tree trunk to let Guyuan see him. Relieved, Guyuan turned back to the party. Then, as if he realized something, he coughed and casually set his bottle of wine back down. Changung's eyes curved up at the corners. "You don't need to do anything. Just remember they're always thinking of you. You'll get used to it in time. It's no problem." As he said these last words, a servant ran over and offered him a polite salute, then took Chun-An from his care. "Hold on. One of these is for you." Changung pulled 2 longevity lock necklaces of different sizes from his pouch and handed them to Chun-An. "The other is for your sister. Go ahead and bring it to her." "Mine is bigger!" Chun-An exclaimed. "You had a little one too when you were born. When your sister gets to your size, we'll get a bigger one for her too." Chun-An blinked. "Then will I get an even bigger one?" Changung rapped him on the forehead again. "You wish. How old will you be by then? It'll be time for you to be a man of character. You won't be begging for any longevity necklaces," he teased. "Go on and get some sleep. Watch out. If you don't sleep enough when you're a kid, you might never grow into a man of character when you're older." Chun-An stuck his tongue out at him, then put the longevity necklaces away with great care before following the servant to his rooms. Changung's sharp ears caught the servant rambling as they walked away. "The general said the young master didn't eat much at the banquet, so he asked us to heat up some milk porridge. You should have some before bed." Startled, Chun-An cast a glance at his father, who had been surrounded by people all day, then turned back toward Changung. Changung waved at him and walked into the hall. The family feast in the Shun estate continued late into the night. Afraid to make things awkward for the others, Changung had only stayed briefly and spoke a few words to Miss Chun through the wall in the rear courtyard before taking his leave. Guyuan had arrived on horseback, but when the gathering was over, he headed straight for a nondescript carriage parked in the back alley. Upon opening the carriage door, Guyuan hissed at the wall of cold air that hit him, then snatched the basin of ice cooling the interior away from Changung. "If you're going to keep it that close, you might as well cuddle the thing. Why are you using so much ice when summer's almost over? Don't be so greedy." "You're one to talk." Changung laughed, then rolled up the scroll he was holding and rapped on the front of the carriage. The carriage trundled forward as the two of them talked of this and that, until Changung suddenly remembered. That's right. Xiao An was a little jealous today. Guyuan had been leaning against the side of the carriage, resting his eyes, but at this, he opened them and gave Changung a mystified look. "Ah?" "I knew it." In a tone of fond exasperation, Changung quickly recounted how Chun-An had been stewing in secret. The little guy thought no one else was like that. That he was the only one. What was it again? Pettiness is not the conduct of a man of character. Who taught him such grown-up words, I wonder? "I was curious why you stood out in the courtyard so long. What did you tell him?" "What could I tell him? I just gave him a little encouragement. It'll be up to his parents to keep things fair in the future." Changung smiled. "Actually, I think I'm quite like him in this respect. We're both sincere. Chang'eng started in surprise. What? However challenging it is for heavy armor to turn in its tracks, it's even more so for deep water to change its course. Guyun reclined in his seat with a lazy tilt of his head, fixing his full attention on Chang'eng. Silly kids who are deep and honest in their affections always take a bit longer adjusting to a new person in their lives. How come I never thought to put it that way? Chang'eng asked. He quietly averted his gaze, the base of his ears going a magnificent shade of scarlet. Homecoming. Winter was mild in Jiangnan. Some of the hardier plants even remained green. But for some reason, traveling during this season still felt bitter, as if it wasn't much warmer than the capital's snowstorms and blowing frost. A caravan of steam carriages traveled along the road, escorted by a dozen or so riders on horseback. The carriages at the back of the caravan held goods, while the other in the lead carried passengers. A colorful little bell hung from the curtain, tinkling as the window was pushed open by an 8 or 9-year-old girl. She poked her head out, then called to the rider in the lead. "Daddy, are we late?" The man pushed up his visor. He was comfortably middle-aged, with a lean face and fine freckles at the corners of his eyes. Perhaps because he spent his youth in the military, he looked rather severe at first glance. But his face softened at once as he turned toward the girl. "We're not late. Sit down and don't stick your head out. You'll catch a cold in this wind. And tell your mom to slow down. Your dad's old bones can't keep up." A woman sat inside the carriage. It was impossible to guess her age from her appearance, but she was dressed in the style of a married woman. She laughed and tapped the back of the iron puppet driving the carriage. Their speed noticeably slowed. Bringing out a teen and placing it across her lap, she began to pluck out a leisurely tune between jostling bumps of the carriage. The carefree notes of Plum Blossom Melody spilled back along the tracks their wheels left behind on the road. It was New Year's Eve, in the second year of the young emperor's new calendar. Shen Yi had been in Jiangnan performing an inspection of the local garrison. Since he couldn't make it home for the New Year's holiday, he had sent for his wife and daughter instead. The whole family was going to Greenhaven to celebrate the holiday and sponge a free meal. Located in Jiangnan, Greenhaven, also known as the Gu Haven, was the villa Guyuan had bought from the former Taishu emperor using war beacon tickets purchased by the Marquis of Anding's estate. On reflection, Guyuan had struck a truly terrible deal. After haggling for the villa, it still half belonged to the former emperor in the end, and it was also His Majesty who made all the final decisions in the household. But Marshal Gu had always been careless about his personal property, and this wouldn't be the first time he had failed to do his math. One imagined he was used to getting screwed over. Shen Yi and his party reached Greenhaven that evening. The villa was backed by mountains and bordered by water. Its rows of steam-powered lamps could be seen all the way down the road. Perhaps because they were celebrating the New Year, all had been fitted with red lampshades. Each cast a warm little halo of light, a lovely sight from a distance. In lieu of a straight road, a series of waterside pavilions led to the front gate. Guests were invited to walk through a meandering floating corridor, while carriages took the long way around and would be parked elsewhere. A pavilion for welcoming guests was situated along this winding avenue. Hanging curtains blocked the wind while steam puffed from braziers and billowed across the wind so that the pavilion looked as if it was floating above the clouds. Shen Yi's personal guard went ahead to deliver a calling card. Before he could finish announcing himself, a hand brushed aside the curtain. "You arrived before I could finish my first cup of tea," the man said with a laugh, striding out. Jumping in shock, Shen Yi hurriedly dismounted his steed. The figure who had stepped out of the pavilion had hair like ink-dyed silk and held his hands primly behind his back, the former emperor himself. No matter how bold Shen Yi might be, he didn't dare make the former emperor wait on him. He scrambled over to salute, but before he could bend at the waist, Chang'eng impatiently gestured for him to rise and called out to his little daughter, Shen Yan. Shen Yan didn't give a fig for her dad's etiquette. She happily ran over with a cry. "Uncle Li!" Chang'eng looked at Shen Yi with a shadow of a smile. You old stick in the mud. Yenar, come. Are you cold? Where's your Dage? Little Uncle Ge kidnapped Dage, Shen Yan pronounced. After Master Feng Han had retired, the Lingshu Institute fell into the hands of Ge Chun. Shen Yi's eldest son had inherited every bit of his father's rebellious, unreliable love of engines. Now 16 years of age, he had neither scholarly nor military achievements to his name. He had spent his childhood rolling around with iron puppets and eventually rolled all the way to the Lingshu Institute, becoming Ge Chun's disciple. Chang'eng took the little girl's hand. What did he kidnap him for? He teased. Shen Yan held her hands wide. They're making a new great condor. Chang'eng chuckled, then pulled out a far Western-style mirror with a wooden frame. It was carved in the shape of a peacock, every feature rendered in lifelike detail. One wing had a little sliding door, behind which was a slot for one of a set of tiny paintings. The paintings seemed to take inspiration from the Gongbi realist style, but also bore a resemblance to far Western paintings, perhaps some unidentifiable fusion of the two. Either way, they were exquisite. Your Daga is making a great big bird, so Uncle Lee will give you a miniature one, Chang'eng said. The peacock is the king of all birds. When Yenar grows up, you'll have to be a lot more accomplished than your Daga. When Shen Yan was small, her parents were often away from the capital. If neither of them could take her for long, they would bring her to the Marquis of Anding's estate. Until the age of 5, she grew up half under Chang'eng's watch. She never adhered to formalities around the former emperor and gladly accepted whatever he gave her, smiling so wide her eyes curved into slits. Thinking the trinket was some tribute from the far Westerners, Shen Yi said, "Children don't know the value of things. Your Majesty, you mustn't give her anything too precious." Not at all. My better half made this himself in an idle moment. Chang'eng waved him off. He wanted to come out and welcome everyone, but he's caught a bit of a cold, so I told him to stay in. Ji Pingxiong, don't fault him. Shen Yi snarked to himself. That guy lazes around at home and shoos the former emperor out to welcome their guests. Yet, who would dare find fault with him? Chun Qingxu glanced at her daughter's new toy, then at the wooden hairpin in the former emperor's hair. The hairpin was carved in a style identical to that of the peacock's plumes, clearly the work of the same hand. She studied Chang'eng's outfit, unremarkable at first glance, but upon closer inspection, every detail was carefully considered. This was a style noble young masters used to favor, wanton extravagance expressed in the subtlest ways. She smiled. Your Majesty revolutionized the old and brought in the new, drawing a new sky over our heads. There are strange new fashions sweeping the nation every year. In such numbers it's impossible to keep up. The old aristocratic styles, with the painstaking effort and careful consideration they require, are seen so rarely now. Everyone is a twitter with the fresh and novel, yet it is your Majesty who has preserved the most authentic traditional styles. Chang'eng looked down at himself, helpless amusement spreading over his face. He shook his head. Since when have I ever cared for these things? Indeed, Chun Qingxu still remembered what His Majesty had been like as a young man traveling the Jianghu. He carried 2 or 3 changes of clothes in order to maintain some semblance of presentability, but he was a village boy turned emperor in the end. Deep down, he was never particular about fashion. Chun Qingxu ducked her head with a smile. She knew this must be another one of a certain someone's domestic hobbies. Guyuan was a particular sort of man. On the one hand, he was good at making do. He had spent long stretches of his youth on the borders marching with the troops, where one got by with what one had. He could swallow down iron-hard flour cakes and half-cooked, bloody strips of meat without flinching, or fall asleep on a bed of hay with a rat for company in the imperial dungeons and never bat an eye. But just because he could rough it when necessary didn't mean that was his natural inclination. Guyuan had been born with all the potential to grow into a playboy young master. Even if it had been beaten back by circumstance, that sprout of extravagance was still one that would grow big and strong if allowed the slightest ray of sunlight. Given the opportunity to meddle, his efforts would surely bear fruit. everything in Green Haven, from the pavilions at the gate requiring guests to dismount their horses and carriages to the inner gazebos encircled by winding brooks, the plum groves that released their lovely fragrance as one promenaded through the snow, the kites upon which one could ascend high into the air and view the spread vista beneath, the interlocking eaves of covered corridors curving between rockeries, was exquisite in every detail. Most of the plaques around the villa were in Guyuen's own handwriting, and some were accompanied by small poems composed by Chang'eng. These two had certainly been making the most of their leisure time. It was nothing like what Shunyi remembered of the old Marquis estate, which had been as abandoned as a haunted house. Shunyi clucked his tongue. Thank goodness the old Marquis was so strict with him. If he allowed this man to follow his natural instincts, what sort of frivolous pippinjay would he have grown into? Uncle Li, Shunyan asked, what are they doing up there? She pointed up at the rooftop where a giant iron puppet the height of 2 men was installed. It was only a skeleton, with most of its outer plates not yet attached, and several people were orbiting around it in a flurry of movement. Chang'eng followed her pointing finger and blanched. Guzishi, get down from there! One of the figures on the roof turned and tossed him a smile. It was Guyuan, undignified as ever in middle age. Aside from some streaks of silver at his temples, he scarcely changed after all these years. It was clear he had been very well taken care of indeed. Guyuan was directing the people on the roof as they tinkered with the half-assembled iron puppet. His eyes lit up when they fell upon little Shunyan, but before he could call out a greeting, cries of alarm sounded behind him, followed by a sharp gust of wind. Someone had accidentally triggered one of the mechanisms of the puppet, and it began to spin in place. The meter-long iron-bone fan in its hand sliced toward Guyuan's wrist. "Ayah!" Shunyan cried out in shock. Lightning quick, Guyuan bent backward at the waist, the fan brushing his sash as it whipped over him. He turned, leapt down from the roof, and landed lightly on the ground with a swish of his hems. Shunyan gaped, and Guyuan picked her up and spun her in a circle. Little beauty, look how much you've grown. Shunyan scrunched up her face. Guyuan swept a fingertip over the bridge of her nose. But you didn't get even a tail heavier. Is your dad starving you with his miserly ways? Hearing she'd grown up tall and slender, the little girl grinned. After charming her daughter, Guyuan looked up at Chen Qingshu. And Miss Chen, how are you? Chen Qingshu had a steady temperament and had never liked being pandered to, but it was impossible to overstate how satisfying it was to hear herself called Miss Chen. When she had just married Shen Yi, Chen Qingshu was happy enough to hear young madam, but it had been almost 20 years since then. Her son would soon be old enough to head a household of his own, and she ran the risk of going from young madam to old madam. Although madam was dignified, could anything beat Miss in youthful freshness? Chen Qingshu offered him a rare smile. Good, thank you for asking. After thoroughly flattering the two ladies with a few words, Guyuan turned and gave Shen Yi a cursory pat on the shoulder. Shen Yi hadn't received a speck of sincerity from this man in years. He scoffed. So you do remember I exist. I'm honored, sir. By this time, Huodan had trotted out to usher their guests inside. Guyuan, a few steps behind, was about to start after the others when Chang'eng snatched his wrist. A certain someone told me his back hurt last night, and he couldn't be touched. Chang'eng murmured into his ear. Yet you look to be in excellent shape tearing up the rooftops today, Guyuan rubbed his nose. It hurt yesterday, but it's better now. People must refresh themselves anew each day so as not to let beautiful sights and wonderful times pass them by. Don't you agree? He felt a hand drag its way deliberately down his spine, then trail over his waist. Chang'eng smiled stiffly. It's just as Yifu says. Guyuan felt himself shudder. He sensed this day wouldn't end well for him. It's New Year's Eve. We have to stay up tonight, he said. If you want payback, save it for later. Chang'eng casually pulled his hand away. Did I say I was going to do anything? Guyuan was silent. Shen Yan turned and yelled, Uncle Gu, hurry up! Don't run so fast, you'll fall, Guyuan called back. On New Year's Eve, the grounds of Greenhaven were lit as bright as day. The curious Shun Yan finally got to see what the iron puppet on the roof was for. Assembled with a slim figure and draped in a long-sleeved dancer's dress, the massive thing looked exactly like a bright and shining shadow puppet from a distance. The fan that had nearly sliced Guyuan in two was wrapped in several meters of silk, and as it spun around and around in a cloud of billowing steam, lit by gas lamps anchored to the roof, it looked like a legendary beauty putting on a magnificent show. The kite in the courtyard, strung with lanterns on both ends, hovered like a giant lotus flower in the sky. As night fell, firecrackers popped in the surrounding villages, growing louder by the minute until everyone had to shout to be heard even when indoors. This place that had been deserted and desolate 20 years ago had fully recovered its vitality with the efforts of one generation. Unlike the shallow displays of prosperity in the capital, the banquet held in Greenhaven was a proper family feast. The 4 adults and 1 child sent away the servants and sat around a small furnace, warming their own wine and cooking their own meat. Guyuan had been permitted 3 cups of wine for the evening. Only on holidays could he convince Chang'e to allow him this much. He treasured the rare opportunity, savoring every mouthful and chasing every last drop. When he reached out again after his 3 cups were up, Chang'e pinned his hand to the table in a practiced motion and shot him a subtle look of warning. Eyes slightly red at the corners from the warm wine, Guyuan looked at him with a hint of a smile curving his lips, coaxing him to relent. Chang'e was too weak to this kind of look. He averted his gaze, refusing to fall for Guyuan's tricks. "Don't make eyes at each other in front of my daughter," Shunyi sniped at Guyuan. It was already late. Shenyan yawned as she curled up in Chen Qingshu's arms. The former emperor coughed and pulled his hand away, turning toward her with a genial smile. "Yanar, are you tired? Go ahead and sleep." Shen Yan rubbed her eyes. "I want to stay up. I haven't even had dumplings yet." Guyuan laughed and called for a servant to make a quick pot of dumplings for the girl. He took 2 wind slashers from the weapons rack in the courtyard and tossed one to Shunyi. "Jiping, let's have a quick spar to keep my niece awake. I want to see how you've regressed." Neither of them released their wind slashers' blades. The sound of the black iron stabs crashing against each other echoed through the chilly night air. Shunyan twitched and woke up at once, sticking her head out to watch the fight. Guyuan struck quickly and danced back, hopping across the carved railings in the corridor before leaping, sparrow-like, onto the roof of the building across the way. Shani followed a step behind. Rather than sparring, it was better to say they were play acting to give the girl a show. Neither of them went all out, instead using their ominous weapons to perform all sorts of tricks. Up on the rooftop, Guyuan leapt onto the fan in the hand of that still spinning iron puppet, its colorful silk blooming beneath his feet. Opting to play dirty, Shunyi thrusted his wind slasher forward, wedging the tip between the teeth of the gears of the puppet's shoulder. With a quiet click, the iron puppet froze in perfect time with a pause in the Guqin music drifting over from the front courtyard. "Huh! You bastard!" Guyuan cursed cheerfully. Just as he and the iron puppet looked as if they would lose their balance, he stumped down with just enough force to dislodge Shunyi's wind slasher. The iron fan swept right at Shunyi's face, and Shunyi deftly bent to dodge as if he expected it. He retreated a few steps, landing on the other side of the puppet. Following the rhythm of the music, the 2 combatants moved in unison, manipulating the iron puppet like a toy and making it dance and stop on command. It hit every beat with immaculate timing, as if alive. Shunyan's tiredness was completely forgotten. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the show. A chain of fireworks burst somewhere in the distance, and the silhouettes of the 2 fighters and their iron puppet nearly disappeared into the sparks. Chen Qingshu shook her head with a smile. "These generals are like 2 monkeys. For shame. Is it not a good omen that the keen blades used to stake claim on our borders and defend our state are now used for play?" Chang'eng set down his cup of wine and retrieved the Lin Yuan wooden tablet from his sleeve. Only 2 pieces of its original 5 remained. He removed one and handed it to Chen Qingshu. When I left the capital, I returned the pieces belonging to Great Master Liao Zhen and the Du family. Master Feng Han wrote in his will that Ge Chun was to take up his mantle, so I gave his piece to Xiao Ge. The Chun family's piece should also return to its rightful owner. As for the one belonging to General Zhong, I'll keep it for now. Once I find a suitable candidate, I'll pass it on. It seems the Lin Yuan tablet will disappear for another several centuries, Chen Qingshu said, accepting the token. Ideally, several millennia, Chang'eng replied. They tucked away their wooden tokens and clinked their cups in a toast, sealing away a great beast beside that little New Year's furnace. All right, everyone. I did it. I stuck it out for you all and read more chapters than I intended. What was that? Like 5? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? Oh, shoot. I read 6 extras for you guys. No, I can't count. It was 5. Definitely 5. Anyway, I don't really have a lot to say. I kind of read these in 3 different segments throughout the day, so my steam for commenting on things at the end kind of died down for this video. But I will say, I did enjoy these past couple of chapters of just getting to know Shen Yi and Chen Qingshu's family a little bit. And their daughter is adorable, and I love that she's so comfortable with Chang'eng, compared to Shen Yi and other people who knew him before he was His Majesty. It's nice to see someone who just has no regard for that, and she's like, he's family, which is really cool. I also like some other things. I do have a couple of points that I wrote earlier today. So let's see. Oh, one of the things I wanted to talk about really quickly was how the phrase was mentioned, no child will fear someone who loves them. And I kind of wanted to change that a little bit and say no child will fear someone who loves them properly. Because there are a lot of parents and guardians in this world who think that what they're doing is displaying love to their children. But some of those things that they're doing are toxic or hurtful. And so it just, that just made me think about that. It's like, no, actually, some people's version of love is quite twisted. And the people that they're taking care of or showing this love to will be very much afraid. Nevertheless, it's nice to know that Gu Yun was not afraid of his father. Which brings me to my next point. Gu Yun asking Chang'eng why he was afraid of Xuniang was just ridiculous. I was like, what do you mean? Why was he afraid of Huga-R? The woman tortured him since he was a baby. A baby. Of course, he is scared of her. She's been his nightmare for his entire life, Well, until she died. But even then, she left scars on him. Gu Yun, you asked that stupid question. Anyway, I also thought it was interesting that Gu Yun, within his dreams, was unlocking some memories from his childhood. And it just kind of reminded me, aside from the fact that, we forget things as we grow older, we can't remember every single detail of life. But when we go through traumatic experiences or hardships, a lot of times our minds will block out our past as a coping mechanism. And so I fully believe that due to a lot of the things that Gu Yun experienced from childhood and through his adulthood, he may have forgotten some of those memories, but it's nice to see that he was able to capture some. And it was also nice to see that, okay, his father wasn't always just sounding awful. Nevertheless, like Gu Yun said, I don't know if I was his father, what I would do in that position, as far as switching up on my son like that and suddenly turning cruel. So I'm not here to judge. It is what it is. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say. Oh, I did have one more note. I thought it was funny that Gu Yun was basically like hinting to Chang'eng that he wanted to have sex without actually saying it directly because he's still feeling some type of way about their relationship based on their identities of, godson, godfather. That was funny. My voice is tired. Okay, I will see you guys next time. Well, I ain't even.